The Old Testament lesson today is Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, which can be found on page 2 in the Old Testament in the Pew Bibles, if you wish to follow along. This passage is about the seventh day of creation, the day of rest. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. The gospel lesson is from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42, found on page 72 in the New Testament Pew Bibles. As Kate said, these verses are about the story of Mary and Martha and their differing priorities when Jesus was the guest in their home. My inclination, and I suspect this is true for many of you, is to see myself in the Martha role rather than the Mary role. Listen to the word of the Lord. Now as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The sisters ran around like crazy. That craziness that comes when you have a guest that's coming. They had the vacuum out and they began to vacuum, and if only they could at least vacuum the dining room and the living room, hopefully he wouldn't notice that the rest of the house was unvacuumed. And on the coffee table, they set out crackers and cheese and a few grapes. And then Martha went off to the kitchen trying to fix the meal so it would look like it was really no big deal to throw it together. And meanwhile, Mary was yelling at the kids to get their equipment, their sports equipment, off of the couch, put it into the laundry room where no one could see it. And just as they were feeling exasperated, they were dividing and conquering this list. They were both praying, "Gosh, I hope he's late." But sure enough, just on time, there's a knock at the door. The doorbell rings. He's here. Jesus has arrived. Martha, in the midst of preparing things in the kitchen, runs to the door, opens it. She has a towel in her hands, kind of drying off her hands as she goes, and says, "Jesus, it's so good to see you. Thank you for coming. Come in, come in. Come have a seat. I'll be in just a minute, but have a seat. I'll be right in." And Mary, she had been in the hallway relocating the piles of laundry that lined the hallway into someplace invisible, came running in, and as she saw Jesus, she stopped. "Jesus, it is so good to see you. Come in. Let us go talk. Let us catch up. I want to hear about all the places you've been. It's so great that you could stop on your travels." And so they go, and in the midst of this coffee table with the appetizers, they sit. And Mary talks about how Sally has moved up to the next level in gymnastics, and Max, well, his lacrosse team went to the regional finals, and they're all really excited about that. But school's starting soon, and well, they're all looking forward to having a regular routine. Those mornings are going to be really early, and they're not quite sure about their teacher, and just meeting new friends and getting into the routine of everything, it's going to be a lot. And so there's a little bit of stress, even though everyone's ready for it to start again. And Jesus is telling Mary about all of his travels, these amazing people who he's run into, and telling stories of his journeys. And in the midst of the stories, he yells out, "Martha, are you going to come in and join us? And Martha pops her head around the kitchen and says, I'll be there in just a minute. I just have a few more things to do. And then she adds sarcastically, you know, Mary, it wouldn't take me this long if I had some help. And there was that awkward silence when someone kind of does a dig. And so Jesus gets up and he walks to the kitchen and he says, Martha, Martha, there is only one thing that's important at this time. Come and sit and let us be together. Sabbath is a time of intentionality. God's intentionality and our intentionality. In the story of creation, we are told how God created the heavens and the earth, the water and the sky, the stars and the plants. Each animal unique, and humans. And then, as we were told in our story this morning, on the seventh day, God rested and said, this is a holy day. We are called to be imitators of Christ. We are to imitate God just like God rested. We too are to rest and proclaim this day as a holy day. I don't know about you, but when I hear the word Sabbath, I cringe a little. I am definitely a Martha. I don't know if you are like that too, but I like to-do lists. And it seems that my to-do lists are never ending. There's always that perpetual, just one more thing that gets added to the list. And while I would love to say, oh yes, let's spend a whole day doing nothing, spending time with God, that sounds just heavenly, no pun intended. I can only imagine that the rest of the week would be filled with me regretting that I took that one day off because I'd be trying to play catch up the entire week. I would love to be those people who could say, oh yeah, I do that, but it's easy to play the martyr and say, I just don't have enough time to set aside a whole day. At least that's how I used to think. When I was in seminary, I was in my third year, we were getting ready, and I think like most people as they began a school year or a new program year, I had the best of intentions. I was going to be on top of all my homework. In fact, I even figured it out how I could work ahead and get papers done on time, and I would get all my reading done, and it was going to be great. Well, a couple weeks in, and I found my to-do list growing, and I was behind in my schoolwork, and I had a paper due that I had just pulled an all-nighter for, and things weren't going as planned. And I knew that something had to change. And so I looked at my schedule, and I reworked my days, and I reworked my weeks, and I thought, I might as well give this Sabbath thing a try. And so I set aside a whole entire day. No church work, no schoolwork, no housework and being busy filling my day with things that needed to be done. Just a day of Sabbath. And while I thought that this would maybe last for a couple weeks at most, I found that something odd happened. Taking this one day off oriented the entire rest of my week. It's as if I had more time because I was taking time off, which is just a weird idea. It served as a grounding for my life, and I can say now that if I didn't take a Sabbath, I think I would be completely lost. What I do on my Sabbath ebbs and flows. Sometimes I am intentional about hanging out with people. Sometimes I do alone time, go on walks or explore someplace new. And sometimes it's a struggle, I won't lie about that, but a lot of times I look forward to that day that I just get to be. The one thing that is always, always a part of my Sabbath, though, is worship. I could not imagine Sabbath without worship. It's that coming together and hearing everyone's voices join together that it just makes God tangible. I couldn't imagine not incorporating worship into my Sabbath. When we stop, we are able to enter into that holy time that God has set aside. But Sabbath is not just the period at the end of a sentence. It's not the finish to something that you do at the end. Sabbath is more like the comma in the midst of a sentence, the breath that you take, the deep sigh that connects one point to another. Sabbath finishes off a week but starts you on a new week. It bridges the gap. Abraham Heschel, in his book, The Sabbath, says, "The Sabbath is not for the sake of the weekday. The weekday is for the sake of the Sabbath. It is not an interlude, but the climax of living. The art of keeping the seventh day is the art of painting on the canvas of time the mysterious grandeur of the climax of creation. As God sanctified the seventh day, so shall we." God calls us simply, plainly, and without an agenda to come and just be. This summer, we have been focusing on Sabbath, and this is the last of the sermons on Sabbath. With this being the last sermon on Sabbath, that means that the school year is quickly approaching, the new program year is starting, perhaps things are starting to pick up at work. And so, as we go through this time of transition before we head into a period of time that will be heavy with work and things, and our to-do list will get filled up, I want to give you a challenge to end off our series on Sabbath. Maybe Sabbath is just already a part of your life. It's something you do and you're happy with it and you're content. Great. Maybe since we've been talking about Sabbath in these series, you've started to look at things and examine your life and try to figure out how it would fit in. Maybe you think Sabbath is a really great word, but you have no idea how it would fit into your life. I would encourage you to sit down with your family or friends or your spouse or even just by yourself and take time to be intentional about how Sabbath can look in your life. Maybe you need to take little baby steps, and it's not a full day that you offer, but little portions of intentional time that you give up to God. Maybe it's making sure that you get to worship every Sunday. I don't know what that's going to look like for you, but I encourage you to look at your schedule and figure out what that is. I promise you, you'll probably hit a few bumps in the road. It happens. But know that God extends grace. God meets us where we are and then takes us from there. Mike Yaconelli, in his book, Dangerous Wonder, reminds us the grace of God is dangerous. It's lavish, excessive, outrageous, and scandalous. God's grace is ridiculously inclusive. Apparently, God doesn't care who he loves. God is not very careful about the people he calls his friends or the people he calls his church. Exactly. God takes you and me and reminds us, just like Martha, that there is only need of one thing. Come, be. There's a phrase that has been thrown around a lot lately. I'll often hear people say, especially when I tell them that I work at a church, I am spiritual, but I'm not religious. Perhaps you've heard it too. What I like about this is the notion that people are seeing God in the everyday. People are seeing God, they're hearing God, they're feeling the transcendence of God, and that's awesome. It's so cool to hear. But what bothers me about this saying is I think that there's one thing missing, and that's the lack of community. I will be the first to admit that church can be messy, and pop culture has not painted church in this pretty ideal setting anymore. But it is our communities of faith that help us orientate our lives from focusing on ourselves to focusing on God. We live in a culture that lifts up autonomy and tells us that it's okay to just focus on ourselves and be ourselves, separate from everything else. But in Christian community, it's so much more. It reminds us that it's not about us, it's about God. C.S. Lewis reiterates this in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, "The terrible thing, the almost impossible thing, is to hand over your whole selves, all of yourselves, all of your wishes and precautions, to give them over to Christ. And that is far easier than what we are trying to do instead. For what we are trying to do is to remain ourselves, to call ourselves our own, to keep personal happiness as our great aim in life, and yet at the same time to still be good. We are trying to let our mind and our heart go their own way, centered on money or pleasure or ambition, and hoping, in spite of it all, to behave honestly and chastely and humbly. And this is exactly what Christ warns us that we can't do. When we come to worship, we bring all of our baggage, all of that stuff that weighs us down, and we lay it at the foot of the cross. We acknowledge that we are broken people, but we are better together as a whole. We do not walk alone. Christ meets us in our brokenness, and he meets us with this transforming grace. Marva Dawn, in her book, Keeping Sabbath Holy, reminds us the Sabbath gives us the opportunity to be in touch with the truth that we are God's people and to reestablish our connections with the eternal instead of being too closely tied up with our present circumstances. It's not about us. It's about God. God invites us into this holy moment, this sanctified time, and says, "Come just as you are. I love you and you are mine." And just like Jesus said to Martha, there is need of only one thing. Come, be. Amen.